Hello, my name is Kieran Allen, and I'm from People for Profit. And tonight we're hosting a meeting on probably what is one of the most extremely important topics we should be discussing at this time in our world, namely the horrific war that has been fought in Yemen over the last number of years, which has involved malnutrition of tens of thousands of people, the mass murder of civilians, and all of this has been perpetuated by the Saudi regime in particular, backed up by American and Western powers. So we would like, on this occasion, to try to explain to people what's happening in the Yemen at the moment. And just from the point of view of an introduction, I want to say that in terms of Ireland, Ireland has just recently won a position on the Security Council of the United Nations. We will be, and I'm sorry, I'm speaking here on behalf of Bree Smith, who's having technical difficulties, I'm afraid, getting on. But as People for Profit and our members of Parliament, we will be pushing the Irish government to come out absolutely clearly and call for an embargo on any arms sales to Saudi Arabia, for, if you like, imposing sanctions on Saudi Arabia, and indeed taking severe action to make Saudi Arabia stop its terrible war in the Yemen. Now, tonight, it's my privilege really to welcome as speakers for this panel a number of very important experts who know a lot about the Yemen. We'll have time afterwards for a question and answer session. But without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Tim Anderson, who has worked at Australian universities for more than 30 years, teaching, researching, and publishing on development, human rights, and self-determination in the Asia Pacific, Latin America, and Middle East. He's a director of the Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies, has published more than 70 articles and chapters in a wide range of books and journals, as well as online essays, and he has a wealth of knowledge on what's happening in the Yemen. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Tim Anderson to introduce our meeting this evening on what's happening in the Yemen.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome to everyone. Thank you to the organisers for organising this important seminar about stopping the war in Yemen. And I want to start with some remarks about the broader context of the war on Yemen. That is to say, its context in what we should call the new Middle East wars waged by Washington since the beginning of this century. There's at least half a dozen wars in the region of which Yemen forms a part, and the aim was spelt out in 2006 by former George W. Bush Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, just before Israel invaded South Lebanon, saying that the US administration was aiming for a new Middle East with freedom and democracy and so on, all of their slogans, but effectively it meant wiping out all independent will in the region. And of course, with the coalition led by Ansar Allah coming to power in Sana'a some 6 or 7 years ago, we know that they were not on the candidate for part of this coalition of freedom and democracy led by Israel and Saudi Arabia in the region at the behest of Washington. So the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the dirty wars on Libya, the dirty war on Syria, the terrorism reignited even more recently in Iraq and Syria, and the war on Yemen have a very deep connection, because the aim is to extinguish any independent political will in the region. And like all great empires, they want to do it to exclude any other great powers from the region. That means Russia and China, any realigned Europe, for example, but also Iran, which is the biggest independent state in the region and a strong supporter of resistance factions from Palestine across the region. So why is it so important for them? Yemen is strategically extremely important for control of the region. The gem is said to be its control of the straits into the Red Sea. And indeed, we have today Israel and the UAE sitting in Eritrea opposite the port in Hodeidah. We have Israel and the UAE occupying Socotra Island, apparently looting Socotra Island also. So the involvement of Israel is no coincidence. When the coalition led by Ansar Allah came to power in Sana'a, they found weapons from the Israeli regime there too. And some time back, not that far ago, there was anticipated that there was going to be Israeli strikes on Yemen, and that is still a possibility, with the same sort of rationale of the Israeli strikes in Syria, that whenever the war on the ground seems to be going wrong, and of course we know now that the Saudi assault against Yemen has been pushed back, effectively Israel will intervene, or it may consider it in its interest to intervene and to try and turn the course of that war, just as it does in Syria. Recently, the Israelis in the Red Sea intercepted tankers going from Yemen through the Red Sea to Syria, tried to stop them, that temporarily delayed them. So there is an Israeli hand in all of these actions, and there's still a great danger that there may be an Israeli intervention there. So the coalition led by Ansarallah certainly controls at least 80% of the populated areas in Yemen, despite the fact that the various proxy groups from Saudi Arabia and from the Al-Qaeda and ISIS groups in other parts of the region are causing great damage and great destabilization. The siege on Yemen is a terrible thing, aggravated by the designation by the former US President Donald Trump of Ansarallah as a terrorist group. That only adds to the urgency, the catastrophe of the economic siege and the starvation, the deliberate attempt to starve the people of Yemen to try and collapse the political will in that region. These are well-known tools, the unilateral coercive measures employed by Washington against many of the countries in the region, but its consequences are most catastrophic probably in besieged Yemen. Yet Yemen is fighting back very bravely. It effectively has militarily defeated the Saudis. For all their money, for all their weapons, they aren't able to contain Yemen. But there's an urgent need for the international community now to come to the support of the Yemeni people and to stop the dirty war on Yemen. Thanks very much, Karen.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. That was excellent in terms of introduction to what's happening here. Let me just say before I go on to our next speaker that I've just stepped in here for Breed Smith, who's a member of Parliament in Ireland and who is raising this issue in the Irish Parliament. And also, while I'm at it, let me also apologise for Mick Wallace, who is a member of the European Parliament, who is also due here this evening, but for circumstances beyond our control, hasn't been able to come. Now, our next speaker is Yehan Hakim, who is chair of the Yemeni Alliance Committee, which was formed after Donald Trump's disgraceful racist ban on people coming from Muslim countries. She was involved in supporting Yemeni American communities in San Francisco Bay Area during the period of protest and unrest. The Yemeni Action Campaign organizes protests and actions, coordinates congressional visits, creates social media toolkits and campaigns to resist anti-Yemeni policies. The Yemeni Action Committee's focus recently has been advocating to end US support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen by raising awareness and pushing legislation. Presumably, Yemen will also maybe make some remarks on Biden's recent remarks that he intends to withdraw support for Saudi Arabia. Yemen will be speaking about the US role in the conflict and the growing grassroots advocacy. So it's a pleasure to hear from Yemen on what's happening in the American Solidarity Campaign for Yemen.
Thank you, Kieran. And congratulations to Ireland on winning a seat at on the UN Security Council. I'd like to remind folks where Yemen is. I think that geography matters. So briefly, as a refresher, Yemen is a country at the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula in Western Asia, also known as the Middle East. Yemen is the second largest Arab sovereign state in the region, and it borders Oman and Saudi Arabia. It has a population of over 28 million Yemenis. So I think we heard a little bit about where we are or how we got here, but I want to take it a little bit further. In Yemen's history, there isn't a 10-year period since the 1960s that hasn't witnessed violent coups, civil insurrections, internal conflicts that have not been exacerbated the way we are seeing right now. So naturally, in 2011, when the Arab Spring took the MENA by storm, the democratic wave entered Yemen fairly early, right after Tunisia and Egypt. Yemenis, especially youth in Yemen, poured into the streets. In a country that is highly armed, second to the US per capita, the protests were peaceful. And this revolt was peaceful until about May of 2011. when the Islah Party joined the streets. But the political transition led to mass unrest. So in September of 2014, Ansar Allah or the Houthis staged a coup and marched down to the capital from Saida and took over Sana'a. And that's where they put Hadi, who is been the runaway president for some time, under arrest. Hadi then resigned and fled to Aden in the south. Civil war breaks out between the Houthis or Ansar Allah and the Yemeni army loyal to the Hadi government. So it was a civil war at the time. President Abdul Mansur Hadi then fled to Saudi Arabia, appealing for international intervention. And this is where the trajectory changed. On the eve of March 26, 2015, Saudi Arabia, under the leadership of Malik bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who had only been in power for a few months, launched airstrikes on Yemen, abruptly escalating a local civil war into a regional inferno. It was called Operation Decisive Storm. The intervention began as a mission that was supposed to be temporary, to last just for a few months, but here we are almost 6 years later. And since 2015, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and its coalition, which includes the Arab countries of Kuwait, Bahrain, Sudan, Egypt, Morocco, Senegal, have been bombing Yemen from the air. The coalition is backed and supported by the US and the UK and other partners who have been providing the coalition with, for example, in the US, we train Saudi forces. We also maintain, repair, and upgrade the coalition's vehicles and aircrafts. We provide intelligence support and targeting assistance. If you remember in August of 2018, when a school bus was bombed by the coalition and 40 school children were killed, that is US targeting assistance that made that happen. And there have also been reports of Green Berets, US Special Forces at the Saudi Yemeni border. And this support was scaled back just a bit in 2018 when the Saudi regime murdered Khashoggi. In addition to military support, the United States under the Obama administration, provided the coalition with weapons. Weapons from US made bomb manufacturers such as Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Boeing. For people who are investing in stocks, I want you to remember these corporations: Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Boeing. These bombs are made in the USA, kill Yemeni people. There have been over 120 arms contracts totaling $120 million a month. Under the Obama administration, there are over $110 billion worth of arms sales to the coalition. And then when Trump was in office, those contracts increased up to $350 billion. Right now, the Biden administration is putting those contracts on pause. Among the most brutal parts of this war, and one that receives very little attention, is the blockade. The coalition imposed a naval, land, and air blockade on Yemen since the conflict began, which has severely restricted the flow of food, fuel, and medicine to civilians. It continues to prevent much needed aid and nearly all commercial imports from reaching Houthi controlled ports, which is over 80% of the population where they live. And this has had a disproportionate impact on civilians' access to essential goods. In a country that relies heavily on imported food for to up to 80 to 90% of the population, the blockade has been on and off and has been backed by the US Navy. Additionally, the only airport for Yemenis to travel in and out of is in Sayoun, which is in the south. It is a long journey by car or bus, and hardly anyone has the means or the health to travel there. The airport in Aden is open sometimes, but it's not consistent. You know, the people of Yemen are boxed in. We have heard the UN stating that Yemen is on the brink of a famine. The hunger crisis classified by UN agencies has been measured throughout the period of the war, and there are 5 levels of acute food insecurity, from 1 to 5, 1 being minimal and 5 being famine, full on famine. Most of Yemen is on level 3, which is crisis, and level 4, which is an emergency. As of December 2020, over 80% of the population, so that's over 24 million Yemenis, are in need of humanitarian aid, including over 11 million that are in need of acute aid. And these statistics were before the US State Department announced it would designate Ansar Allah as FTOs, or foreign terrorist organizations. Part of our advocacy work has been to reverse this designation immediately. because while we're looking at staggering numbers of mass starvation, further cuts to aid, further restrictions will push Yemen into a level 5, which is full-fledged famine, and starving millions of Yemenis, which is why the blockade on Yemen must be lifted immediately. Aid should never be used as a weapon. And if we look at impact, we're hearing oftentimes Yemen is facing the world's worst humanitarian crisis that we've seen in decades. Yemen is being bombed and starved by some of the most powerful and wealthiest countries. So the impact since 2015 has resulted in approximately, and these numbers I should mention are severely underestimated. It's almost impossible to gather accurate numbers, but over 200,000 Yemenis have been killed by the violence, and over 90,000 Yemeni children have starved to death due to the blockade. The UN released a report that predicts that the death toll will surpass 230,000 by the end of 2020. I want to note that the violence or the death toll due to the violence is attributed to 2/3 of it is due to airstrikes. 90% of Yemenis do not have access to electricity. I think it's something that we can all relate to. What happens to us when we have a shortage? What do we do? And imagine 90% of a country not having access to electricity. Over 16 million Yemenis do not have access to healthcare. This is especially important as we're looking to curb, uh, fatal diseases such as cholera. This has brought on fatal diseases like diphtheria and cholera. One of the worst cholera outbreaks ever recorded has infected over 2 million Yemenis, and thousands have died due to this preventable disease, which should not exist in the modern world. We should not have cholera in the year 2020. Now that COVID has entered the arena, the lack of access to clean water, a crumbled infrastructure, lack of fuel, and a collapsed healthcare system, and also not to mention there have been airstrikes that have hit hospitals and clinics, which has led to their closure. Curbing this virus is seemingly impossible. COVID could spread faster, more widely, and with deadlier consequences than in many other countries. On top of that, the same day that COVID was announced in Yemen, which is in April, two international agencies, USAID and the World Food Program, cut aid into these Houthi controlled areas, which are, like I said, are over 80% of the population. And to date, again, these stats are severely underestimated. We have over 2,000 COVID cases in Yemen, and at least 600 Yemenis have died. So we can see that the situation is complex, and there are many factions in Yemen. There are many challenges that I left out for the sake of time, such as the ongoing drone warfare program that's been bombing Yemenis indiscriminately since 2002, or the Muslim ban, which Biden recently rescinded, or how the UAE has occupied Socotra and Israel's insertion, or how the UAE runs secret prisons allegedly torturing and sexually assaulting Yemenis. Um, it's a lot to take in, but the facts are that without the support of the US, the UK, Canada, France, Germany, and Spain, to name just a few, the coalition led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE will not be able to aggress on Yemen with this amount of force. They do not have the weapons, they do not have the equipment or the training. They rely heavily on the support of the West to commit genocide on Yemen via aerial bombardment and the blockade enforcement, which is why the Yemeni Alliance Committee's advocacy has been focusing on shifting US foreign policy, ending arms sales to the coalition, ending military support for the war, ending enforcement of the blockade, and restoring aid into Yemen. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are not the beacon of light for the Muslim world, nor should the US or the Western powers continue to police the world. Yemen is a sovereign nation, like I said, and only the people of Yemen should have the power to determine where it heads. So when it comes to our advocacy, since we formed in 2017, we have been trying to push US legislation under the title of War Powers Resolution. And the War Powers Resolution is a piece of legislation that was enacted in 1973 during the Vietnam War, which is supposed to put a check on the executive branch in order to prevent overreach. So the war on Yemen, when it comes to the US, the Congress has not authorized it. But we are here funding, fueling, and supporting this war. Biden did make some statements yesterday that he would end support for the war on Yemen. but he was not clear. What support does that mean? Are we going to be ending arms sales? Are we going to be ending targeting assistance or logistical support? So, while we welcome this statement, it is still unclear what support the U.S. is going to end. So we will continue to demand a clear redress when it comes to the role of the U.S. And we're not going to, kind of celebrate or be complicit right now, because what it means for Yemenis is that they will not find peace until aerial bombardment will end. They will not find peace until the blockade is lifted. So until those things happen, we will continue to push the Biden administration to follow through with his promises.
Okay, thank you, Yenin. And it's really good to document and bear witness, as I think you've just done, to the absolute horrors that are taking place in Yemen. Let me just make one small point in response. The Ireland's role in Security Council, we hope very much it doesn't become a puppet of the US and the Western powers, and as left-wingers and socialists in Ireland, we'll be certainly trying to highlight that. You also mentioned the Raytheon Corporation. I mean, can I just report for people generally that one of our proudest moments is when our members occupied Raytheon, revealed its role as an arms supplier to many of the different powers in the world, and indeed forced the Raytheon factory in Derry to close down. This is something we're very proud of. It's something we think that socialists should do across the world to fight against the arms, those who profit from war and from weaponry. Now, our next speaker is Mohammed Al-Wazir. Mohammed is the legal director of the Arabian Rights Watch Association, where he focuses on international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and participates in the United Nations Human Rights Council sessions. Mohammed will speak about the armed conflict and Resolution 2216 of the UN. But however, we will first listen to a statement on Resolution 2216 delivered by Mohammed in a past UN Human Rights Council session, and then we will yield the mic over to Mohammed. So could I ask Mark, first of all, to play the video, and then we'll come in and have Mohammed Al-Wazir speak.
Mr. President, Arabian Rights Watch Association expresses alarm about the ongoing systematic human rights violations in Yemen, stemming in large part from unlawful unilateral coercive measures that have come in the form of a war launched without a UN mandate, involving daily airstrikes on civilians and civilian objects, and a comprehensive aerial and naval blockade imposed under the pretext of implementing UN Security Council Resolution 2216, which is an arms embargo on 5 named individuals being abused to justify the use of starvation as a weapon of war. While airstrikes targeted civilian objects, killing and maiming over 60,000 civilians, the blockade on food and medicine created conditions that led to the death of over 200,000 children and the acute malnourishment of 3 million women and children, as 18 million are food insecure. According to local authorities and as reported by international NGOs, over 27,000 civilians needing medical treatment abroad died because of the Saudi coalition flight ban on Sana'a International Airport, while thousands more have no choice but to live with compromised health and pain. Taken together, the airstrikes and blockade are measures deliberately inflicted on the Yemeni people that create conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction. These are crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity. It is impunity that allows 5 women to die every day by an airstrike. It is impunity that allows a child to die every 10 minutes by a blockade. It is impunity that allows these systematic rights violations to continue. Mr. President, the international community has a legal and moral duty to alleviate the appalling levels of human despair by ending the airstrikes and blockade on Yemen and ensuring accountability for this entirely man-made catastrophe. Thank you, Mr. President. All right. Thank you for the introduction, Kieran. Glad to be here to address the Irish people, and it's an opportune time given the Security Council seat that Ireland possesses now. I'll start off by, I came across some stereotypes of the Irish people that reminded me of the Yemeni people themselves. They have some common things with Yemenis, especially when it comes to stereotypes that I'm going to discuss with you right now. Whereas some believe that the Irish only eat potatoes, Yemenis are thought of as only eating fenugreek, helba. Whereas some may think that the Irish are a drunk bunch, there are those who believe all Yemenis are high on gat. Whereas some believe that the Irish are extremely violent. In Yemen, well, you know, it may not be just Yemenis, but a whole region of people who are thought to be extremely violent. Repetition of false narratives plays a role indeed. And the stereotypes of the Irish people are not any different, nor is the war on the Yemeni people and how it's been explained in the media and in discussions, international forums. But before I talk about the war and the UN Security Council Resolution 2216, it is necessary to briefly go over the events that led to the war and the subsequent passage of the resolution. And I'll take an angle that was different than Jihan's because she did a good job of explaining what has happened, but I'll discuss the events as it relates to 2216. It was in this month of February, 10 years ago, in 2011, when millions of Yemenis took to the streets protesting the 33-year rule of Ali Abdullah Saleh's presidency. So what did the Yemeni people want? Well, the people had the following demands. They wanted to establish a decentralized state. They wanted to resolve the grievances in the southern governorates. They wanted to resolve the conflict in the northern governorates, particularly the Saada region. They wanted to distribute wealth and public sector jobs fairly and resolve Yemen's overall economic problems. They wanted an end to corruption, cronyism, nepotism by creating national institutions based on merit. They wanted to prosecute Saleh and members of his administration for past crimes and corruption. And finally, they wanted to make the war against terror groups a national issue by marshaling all resources to not only combat terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but to in effect neutralize and eliminate the threat posed by their activities. These demands sum up the wishes of the people. This was their dream, a republic that established justice for its citizens without exception, a republic that could safeguard peace and security for its people so that they may develop their faculties and prosper, a republic that was free from foreign dictates, whether those dictates came from states in the region or those further away. So what happened to those demands? Instead of a change in government, the Yemenis were faced with the GCC initiative, which through an unconstitutional single candidate election imposed the rule of an unpopular vice president belonging to the same government they sought to change, and who remained indefinitely beyond the term permitted by the GCC initiative. Whereas he was supposed to call for a referendum on a draft constitution and hold general elections within 2 years, he did neither, yet still to this day claims to be the president 9 years later, 6 years of which were spent in de facto exile in Riyadh. All, of course, with the blessing of the international community. Instead of prosecuting government officials for corruption, the GCC initiative that brought Hadi to power granted those same officials immunity from prosecution. Instead of discussing appropriate levels of decentralization during the transition period, at the National Dialogue Conference, a federation of 6 states was going to be imposed without a vote or referendum, despite Yemen not having a large landmass, nor the diversity in language, religion, and culture that justifies such division. Instead of resolving southern grievances, a number of armed groups loyal to a coalition of states were established, this is after the war of course, alongside secret torture prisons to compromise Yemen's territorial integrity. Instead of solving the grievances in the Saada governorate, a war was launched and the entire region was unlawfully deemed a military zone to justify indiscriminate killing of tens of thousands of civilians in that governorate. Instead of ensuring the fair distribution of wealth among the population, a blockade was imposed on food, medicine, and fuel imports, and public sector salaries were withheld by the Hadi administration to impoverish and starve millions. Instead of supporting the near successful efforts of the Yemeni people to entirely eliminate the threat posed by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a war was launched that facilitated the spread of Al-Qaeda again across regions they were previously eliminated from. This is what happened to those demands. So right before the run-up of the war, or the run-up to the war, despite an expired unconstitutional term, and despite resigning and without transferring power to a successor with consensus, Hadi attempted to move the government to Aden, but was not successful as he ended up fleeing from the Sana'a forces that were led by the Ansar Allah GPC alliance. GPC, the General People's Congress Alliance party. And that occurred on March 25th, 2015, the date of when he fled Yemen. One day later, on March 26th, 2015, of course, based on a letter that Hadi had submitted to the UN, stating that he has requested a military intervention to protect Yemen, a coalition of states, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, which withdrew from the coalition 4 years ago, back in June 2017, Kuwait, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco, which also withdrew back in 2019. This coalition launched a war on the people of Yemen without a UN mandate. From the outset, the Saudi-led coalition was supported politically, militarily, and diplomatically through logistics, intel, and weapons transfers by the United States of America, UK, and France, as was mentioned earlier. 3 weeks after the start of the war, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 2216, which together with UN Security Council 2140 established an arms embargo, asset freeze, and travel ban on 5 named individuals in Yemen. UN Security Council Resolution 2216 did not call for war on Yemen. The resolution in its plain terms instructs states to take measures to prevent, and I quote, the transfer of arms and to inspect cargo at their own airports and seaports heading to Yemen if there are reasonable grounds to believe the cargo contains prohibited items, end quote. It does not permit withholding cargo that is not prohibited by the resolution, such as commercial imports and exports or humanitarian aid, which is what the coalition is withholding. There are anywhere between 10 to 20 ships in any given month being detained by the coalition, some for over 100 days. And despite the ships being verified, inspected, and permitted by the UN verification and inspection mechanism. According to the UN Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, the late Idris Jazairi, the blockade, and I quote, involves a variety of regulatory, mostly arbitrary restrictions enforced by the coalition forces, including an unreasonable delay and or denial of entry to vessels in Yemeni ports, that amounts to an unlawful, unilateral, coercive measure under international law, and that involves grave breaches of the most basic norms of human rights law, as well as of the law of armed conflict, which cannot be left unanswered, according to the UN Special Rapporteur. He, along with 3 other UN Special Rapporteurs, signed off on this stance and issued this press release. The Group of Eminent Experts report issued on August 28, 2018, also discussed this aspect of the conflict in detail, where it states that no possible military advantage could justify such sustained and extreme suffering of millions of people. And it goes on to state that the coalition has failed to cancel or suspend the restrictions as required by international law. Since they've already been put on notice by the previous UN special rapporteurs, they should know that what they are doing is illegal and is resulting in human rights violations and crimes that they will be held accountable to. Yet they still continue, despite those stances. So the coalition's unilateral action to launch a war occurred without a UN mandate and preceded the adoption of Resolution 2216 by 3 weeks, a resolution that did not call for war. Despite this, the coalition cites the resolution as a justification for military action that it claims is to enforce an arms embargo, but that in effect involves ongoing human rights violations and crimes committed against the Yemeni people. It amounts to using starvation of an entire civilian population as a weapon of war. Not only has the resolution been used as a pretext by the coalition to justify the use of starvation as an instrument of war, the resolution by its plain terms was not applicable then for it to be applicable now after 6 years of war. A new resolution needs to be passed reflecting the realities on the ground and cannot be terms or cannot have or contain terms that one would find in an agreement where one side is surrendering, calling on one side to hand over their weapons, withdraw from cities. Terms such as these do not support a peaceful settlement. They do not reflect the reality on the ground and simply are not they're not achievable. As Yemenis were negotiating the future form the government would take, a serious foreign intervention occurred that derailed the entire process of political negotiations, and with it the potential for Yemenis to arrive at a solution that would govern themselves peacefully. And this is what the former UN special envoy to Yemen, Jamal bin Umar, said. He stated unequivocally 3 weeks after the start of the war that when the coalition's military campaign started, one thing that was significant but went unnoticed was that the Yemenis were close to a deal that would institute power sharing with all sides. As a result of the war, the process of self-determination was seriously impeded, and we instead stood witness to over 300,000 civilian deaths, the mass starvation of millions, where hundreds of children die every day, and a near complete destruction of civilian infrastructure, all done by unlawful airstrikes, ground shelling, and an unlawful blockade, in addition to economic measures that have impoverished the entire population of 30 million Yemenis. What is needed is the facilitation by the international community of a political solution between Yemeni parties that is codified in a new UN resolution that calls for a comprehensive ceasefire and a return to political discussions with the aim of forming a consensus government. And we hope that Ireland will use its role in the Security Council, use its seat in the Security Council to help achieve peace in Yemen by pushing for a new resolution. It is my genuine hope that the sides, including the international community, have it in them to work together towards putting an end to the war in order to pave the way for a political process that will fulfill the wishes of those millions who demonstrated for a just republic. The nation's well-being depends on it, and perhaps the world's. With that stated, I yield the floor to my colleague Ahmed, who will speak about the negotiations and how they've come along and the prospects for peace in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And just to say, we appreciate very much your comparison between how Irish people and Yemeni people have been portrayed historically by colonialism And we certainly in this country have no belief in the pretensions of Britain, or for that matter, the Western powers, to in any sense bring liberty or aid oppressed people across. Let me now call on Ahmed Al-Shami, who is from the Arabian Rights Watch Association. He is one of the executive directors of the ARWA. He has participated at UN Human Rights Council sessions, civil society observer at UN negotiations between the parties to the war in Yemen. We ask Ahmed if you can share with us more about your experience with these negotiations and how these talks have developed. Please welcome Ahmed Al-Shami.
Thank you very much, and I would like to welcome everybody who is watching us right now. And I would like to thank everybody who started, like my colleague Mohammed and Jihan and Mr. Tim Anderson, and of course the party for organizing this event. Of course, I'll start with the events that started since the war started on the 26th of March 2015. The aggression on Yemen officially started, and everybody at that time was thinking that it will be like a short war, like several weeks, perhaps several months, and everything will be over. But things changed, especially the Saudi-led coalition had this. Were optimistic, and they were planning to achieve their mission within 2 weeks, which then changed to 2 months, then to 2 years, and it's still going on. So the negotiations started between the parties, and here I'm gonna. I just want to use clarify the terminology I'm going to use. I'm going to refer to the Ansarullah and General People Congress Alliance as the de facto authorities. So I'm not going to keep like using this term every time. So de facto authorities in Sana'a, and there is the Hadi government, the government in exile, which is also supported by the Saudi-led coalition and the international community. And of course, there were several rounds of negotiations, and those negotiations, I cannot even call them negotiations. They weren't really negotiations. So the first 2 rounds were in Geneva and Biel in Switzerland, and they were vague. They didn't even discuss any of the essential matters of the war or of the possibilities of ending the war. And actually, it was like off and on. So the Hadi government delegation used to leave the meetings. They weren't serious because the resolution 2216 was one of the supporting keys that the Hadi government always flagged whenever they go to negotiations, whenever they sit on the table. And it didn't work fine. So everybody was optimistic about the Kuwait negotiations, which was 1 year later. And the Kuwait negotiations, of course, and of course, I cannot even call those negotiations. They were more of like conditions that were actually pressured by the international community, by the coalition, and by, unfortunately, the United Nations envoy. They were trying to, the envoy at that time was Ismail Wald Sheikh, and who is now the foreign minister of Mauritania. So what happened is at the Kuwait round, basically what happened was conditions to basically let the de facto authorities leave the capital city of Sana'a and go back to where they came from. That was the term that they used to say, and handle all the weapons to the Hadi government, what so-called legitimate authority. And it didn't make even any sense at that time that to handle the weapons to the people that are actually killing you and fighting you on the ground, instead of making a peace, settlement and a reconciliation. It was actually supporting the Hadi government, which was part of the war, part of the problem. And not only that, the thing is that the de facto authorities agreed to some of those conditions. They agreed that Hadi can come back as a president for 3 months, and then they prepare for elections, or perhaps there should be like a supreme security council and a supreme supreme military and security council that is representing all the parties in the war and some neutrals too. And of course, even though they accepted this, they still didn't agree to allow it to happen, because they were demanding to hand the weapons. They didn't have to do it. And the main reason is because it's not because of the Hadi government, it's because of the coalition itself. It didn't achieve its targets because they had high ambitions to achieve to win the war in few weeks, and it didn't happen. And of course, just to clarify here, the war started actually, and Hadi, who was the president then, didn't even know that the war started. They just claimed that that they had a green light from the Yemeni government, and then he said it himself in an interview that he had no idea that the war will start, and then they started claiming that they have a green light and all that. So regarding the handling the weapons, it is so complicated. During Kuwait, and I think Ireland has an experience in that. It usually takes, from what I know is that it took several years in Ireland to merge the process of merging the fighters and handing the weapons. It took several years, so it cannot happen just by one click on one day or in few weeks. It's impossible, especially when you are in a very severe war and a community that everybody have his own personal weapon. So putting this aside, it didn't work at all. So then everybody was optimistic for the new rounds. So a new envoy was assigned by the Security Council, Martin Griffiths. He's from the UK. And of course, a reminder, UK is the pen holder of Yemen on the Security Council. So everybody was optimistic that the UK will support peace, implementing peace in Yemen, will support the new. And 1 year during his mission passed away and nothing happened. And then they managed to organize the Stockholm consultations. The Stockholm consultations started on the 4th of December 2018 until the 18th of December 2018. So it was 2 weeks consultations. It wasn't even negotiations, and I'm gonna verify or explain later why I'm insisting that all those rounds didn't have real negotiations on the table. So it was consultations. Both parties were isolated on their on one side of the hotel. They didn't meet face to face in negotiations. And the UN was meeting every party separately, and they did not achieve anything in the Stockholm consultations except the Hodeidah agreement, which of course was at least something good, that because it avoided a humanitarian catastrophe in the city of Hodeidah. It's the main hub for humanitarian aid in Yemen, where it covers more than 80% of the aid supplies to the Yemenis. And of course, other important topics such as the political framework, the economic agreement regarding revenues, regarding salaries. And I would like also to clarify that Yemenis did not get paid salaries for the past 4 years, So thing happened, and it was the Hadi government that was insisting in getting everything in charge on their behalf, and they didn't want to move on with any joint committees between the two parties, just as a goodwill to end the war and start, getting the Yemenis to relax or have a break, after this long journey of war in Yemen. So after the Stockholm negotiations or consultations, things are still paused. Nothing changed. The war is still continuing. The aggression is still continuing. And the humanitarian condition is getting even worse day after day. And to move forward on this, there should be actually two simultaneous tracks that should be implemented to avoid in order to accomplish peace in Yemen. So there should be serious negotiations and between the de facto authorities and the Hadi government on one side, and a simultaneous negotiation between the de facto authorities and the Saudi government, because the Saudis are claiming that they have security concerns because Yemen is in the south of their border, and they're worried about any violence or anything that might affect their border. And of course, they're the only country that is that's having these worries. I mean, Oman is also bordering Yemen, but they don't have these worries. Actually, Oman now is worried from the Saudi occupation of Al Mahra now, because the Saudis are occupying a governorate that is bordering Oman. Anyways, going back, that these two tracks should be implemented, and in order for them to start to be implemented positively, there should be a ceasefire so that it gives the opportunity for the parties to meet with no pressure on the ground. And also there should be a removal for the blockade, because you cannot have negotiations and the blockade is still imposed. The Salah International Airport had been closed for almost 6 years, and the Hodeidah seaport is blocked. The shipments are coming in after detention from the Saudi coalition, and they only allow certain shipments to come in, and the others, it depends on their mood. It doesn't have even a mechanism, So this should be implemented, a ceasefire and a removal of the blockade, in order to create the atmosphere to move forward in negotiations. And then, as I mentioned, there should be two tracks, simultaneous tracks, one with the Saudis and one with the Hadi government, with the de facto authorities. And I think from this, after this ended, there will be a transitional period, and perhaps create a positive atmosphere for elections and moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And our final speaker is, will give a Saudi perspective, is Aziz Al-Moaid from ALQST Human Rights. Aziz is a Saudi citizen now living in Ireland, who has campaigned vigorously against the absolute monarchy that is Saudi Arabia. And I think it's important that for somebody campaigning for democracy in Saudi Arabia, that we also resist its role as a sub-imperialism trying to dominate parts of the region. And I think that Aziz has been very forthright in condemning the war in Yemen. So I'll hand the floor to Aziz and ask him to give us a Saudi perspective and his thoughts on the war.
Thank you very much, Kieran. And I want to thank People Before Profit and everybody who was behind this event. Now, I had a couple of points ready, but I think the colleagues gave a very rich insight, and most of the information I was going to give was said already. But first of all, I want to speak here as an Irish person, because unfortunately, if you have a big mouth like mine speaking against the Saudi, speaking for the human rights in Saudi Arabia, you can't go back to Saudi Arabia and actually most of the Arabian countries. So I feel that my role today and the part I should speak is as an Irish person, because our audience today is
some of the best activists in Ireland, like People Before Profit. You guys really landed in the right place. They are very good at mobilizing. And I think when we talk about stop the war in Yemen, there is a lot of mobilizing involved. And there is an effort that should be put from activists and political people and politicians to support the immediate stop on the war in the war of Yemen. And now I want to take you through a little story. Now, first of all, I want to be very clear. And I think all Saudi or most Saudi people agree with me that there's starting a big apology that should be issued, and it should be known that this is done with our money, but it is not with our will. As an absolute monarchy doesn't reflect what the Saudi people want, and for sure, what we want is not what really not what's happening with Yemen now. Now, the first problem with the Saudi invention in Yemen, or the Saudi-led coalition. My colleagues speak about the group of eminent experts, and they included that the incidents that the Saudi coalition are responsible for the highest number of reported civilian kills and the direct targeting of hospitals, schools, without giving the civilians any warning to leave the areas of military operations. Now, the Saudis have been asked from the international community and pressured about these crimes that can amount to war crimes. And what they did is a committee. The coalition established a joint incident assessment team, GIAT they call it, an investigation mechanism supposed to examine the alleged violation committed by the coalition. Now, the group of experts have found that GIAT lacks transparency and therefore fails to meet the criteria set by the international law to ensure accountability. And this is a behavior, a very problematic behavior, where the Saudi authorities try to play with the international law and make a facade of committees, and they really doesn't reflect anything but the Saudis' lack of interest in human rights and lack of care of the civilians who are dying in Yemen. Now, the second, just to put it in perspective, now, and 24 million people live in Yemen. 80% of the population are in need of humanitarian assistance, including 12 million children in need of food. Now, with the COVID-19 situation, and they ask the Irish audience to feel how the disaster is affecting a country that is developed like Ireland economically and the health system. Now, can you think what's happening in Yemen when you know more than half of the country's health facilities have been destroyed or damaged by the war? Like, can you imagine if half of the hospitals in Ireland are closed and we have the COVID situation? What about a war zone? Going forward, now, let's talk a little bit about the UN and the countries of who are exporting weapons to Saudi Arabia. And I would say some names here of countries, and it's really shameful to have your name in this list. So, enormous countries are selling to Saudi Arabia. America is the key supplier, but the European also have a big part of it. And we have countries, the biggest countries that export weapons to Saudi Arabia that are connected to the war are the United Kingdom, Germany, Spain, France, and Italy. And this is the majority of the arms delivered from Europe. Now, this is against, as my colleagues talked about, the UN and the UE export of weapons rules. And as a part of the European Union, we should contact our TDs and our representative in the European Union, asking them to support any efforts that arise. And that goes hand with starting mobility and activities in front of the Saudi embassy and other places to make people aware of what's happening. Now, the UN chief has delisted the coalition from the annual report of children and armed conflict. Now, this is a report that doesn't have anything but shame. So nothing will be, no sanctions, nothing will be inflicted. The Saudis was removed, but this is not the first time. In 2016, also the Saudis was removed. At the time, the UN Secretary General was Ban Ki-moon. Then he publicly called out Saudi Arabia for effectively blackmailing the UN by threatening to pull funding from UN programs. The reports published in the years since then have downplayed Saudi Arabia's role in endangering Yemeni children. Now, as I start by telling you that the first thing is an apology from the Saudi people from what our leaders are doing and the crimes they are committing against the Yemeni people, I would like the Qasd recommendation for the Saudi government and for the international community. So we ask the Saudi government to end all violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law in Yemen immediately. Immediately, they have to fight across Yemen and implement a complete crossfire on the ground to reinforce efforts of recountering the outbreak of COVID-19. And work with the UN Special Envoy to start a complete political negotiation to find a solution to end the conflict in Yemen. Also, we call the international community to end all licensing for deliveries of arms, ammunition, and military equipment, and to all parties in Yemen, and to promote that's in line with the UN Council resolution in 2015 to 2216 and 2511. Now, how we're gonna end my speak is a call for action to the Irish community. Today, we have a lot of people who are from Yemen who's telling us what's happening over there. What we should answer and ask and build on this meeting. What we gonna do from this moment on to build on an effort. Ireland is a beacon of human rights, and it's in a unique situation where a society is very understanding and standing truly with human rights, where efforts or initiatives can be started here, and we are part of the European Union, and Ireland is very connected with the American politics and the American society. So it's a very good place to take initiatives. Thank you very much, guys, for organizing this.
Thank you very much, Aziz. And we've got a very short time to throw it up and open for questions and answers. But can I just say before we do so, just the reason why People for Profit is organizing this meeting. First of all, to say that we will commit to bringing a resolution to the Irish Parliament to, as people have indicated here, to have an embargo on sales to Saudi Arabia to condemn their war and to, in fact, demand that they withdraw from Yemen. Unfortunately, in the Irish Parliament, we have 3 members of Parliament, and the scope, if you like, for deputies to put down resolutions is rather undemocratic, is limited. So we shall invite all other parties who are in the opposition, and indeed, for that matter, in the government, if they wish to support it, to come and support our resolution. So we very much commit publicly to working with the Yemeni community to putting down that resolution. Secondly, I want to say that People for Profit is a very strong anti-imperialist party. We stand very much with people who are fighting against oppression. We see through very much the hypocrisy of Western democracy, the way it, for example, supports Saudi Arabia, even though it proclaims to the world that it wants to bring democracy to their countries. And lastly, to say we probably will be a little bit more skeptical about the United Nations. We think the United Nations resolutions has often been used as a cover for invasion, for humanitarian interventions, but it's not our role to, if you like, very much engage in that discussion at this particular meeting. We can have that discussion elsewhere. But the main point is we shall be carrying on this fight. We shall raise the issue in the Parliament, and hopefully, given if the opportunity with COVID, we shall also try to mobilize people. Now, I'm not sure of the technicalities here, but if there's any questions anybody wants to ask verbally, or else I can read out a few questions from the chat box. Maybe while people might get their thoughts together, I have 3 questions I see here from the chat box. So maybe whoever wishes to answer it, please do so. So first of all, the question was, has the Houthi organization in Yemen, has its designation as a terrorist organization been overturned? That was one question I've seen. The second question is, what do you want people to do? What sort of solidarity do you want to happen? So let me just take those 2 questions first, and then maybe somebody else might want to come in. So does anybody want to answer those questions? Okay, Mohammed?
I'll just answer that first question about the FTO designation, just in short, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, as you know, there was an FTO designation on Ansarullah, and there was 3 people from the group that were added to the list of especially designated global terrorists. This was done under the Trump administration, I believe, on January 19th, right before the inauguration of Biden. The new administration under Biden has taken it upon itself to review the designation, as well as the U.S. Treasury has issued some general licenses for NGOs that are operating in the humanitarian and human rights field to continue their work while the review is being conducted. And that review is supposed to end at the end of this month, February 26th. And at that on that date, we're supposed to learn more about whether the designation will get revoked or whether it will be refined a bit, or whether it will stay the same. That we will find out in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed.
I add something, Karen.
Yeah, certainly. Who's that?
I think people should campaign for the Biden administration to immediately remove this designation, because it is a serious aggravation on the economic siege of the entire country. So I think we should link it to the siege measures, which are starving the entire population.
Okay, another question that's come in really is a more general question with different interpretations, but it seems pretty. I've got 2 similar type of questions. Why do so many Western countries support a dreadful Saudi regime? And a related question, I think, is why does the UN not publicly recognize that the actions of the USA and its allies break international law on a regular basis? Why do these horrors take place? Anybody want to give a stab at this very general question? These 2 general questions.
Now, if you allow me to mention that the Saudi authorities have used a lot of tools through using weapons and different investments in different countries to build very strong power. So what happened with the UN when Ban Ki-moon said that the Saudis have pressured him into removing Saudi Arabia from a list, or otherwise they will stop the funding. It was simple blackmailing. Now, this in the case of UN was public because somebody decided that this is the right thing to do, is to tell people what happened. But this happened in different countries, and the strongest way to counter it is to make what Saudi Arabia do public, so our politicians are afraid to do business with Saudi Arabia like it's a normal country.
Okay, anybody
Yeah,
else?
if I can add to that, Karen, certainly the Britain, France, and the US are making enormous amounts of money selling weapons to the Saudis and the Emiratis. But more importantly, those governments are all who have veto powers in the Security Council, are all in with the plan to have a new Middle East, to destroy all the independent states there, and to have a region led by Israel and the Saudis. And so then you have the smaller countries like my own country, for example, that have no real spine to stand up to these programs coordinated by Washington and with the important collaboration of Britain and France.
Okay. Any last questions then from anybody, either on the chat or I'm not sure whether you can ask verbally? No. Okay, well, look, I want to, first of all, thank the speakers. I've learned a lot from this meeting. It's been an extremely informative event, and I hope those watching will spread the news about a war that's been pushed off the headlines despite all its horrors, and that in our generation, in many ways, resembles what happened in Vietnam and Iraq and so on in the past. So it's important that people try to highlight what is going on here. So once again, I just want to thank everybody who's attended the meeting, and we will certainly commit to following it up as People for Profit in the Dáil in terms of putting a resolution down and essentially asking Ireland, which is now a position of the Security Council, to come out openly and condemn what's happening in the war. We've absolutely no doubt that if the people of Ireland were asked, that is exactly what they would do. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody.
If you allow me a question for the panel.
Yeah, go on.
Is there any initiatives that we should see or follow online or any way to support the cause that you would like us to know?
Any specific initiatives? Does anybody want to add to that?
Actually,
to oppose the sale of weapons, and to also to stress this humanitarian catastrophe that the blockade has been, preventing food and medicine getting through to the population. The genocidal aspect of this war is something that's urgent, and we should all be stressing.
Okay.
I would like to add a point here regarding an initiative. I think the non-governmental organization community internationally did a great job in organizing and come out with they came out with different initiatives in the past. But I think it's time now to make a bigger coalition of countries to support a peace initiative. It should be a couple of neutral countries that with the vision of really implementing peace and stability in Yemen, rather than as some of the speakers said, that really the international community is really supporting whoever have the money, whoever has the capacity, that will benefit them before others. So it's not looked at in a humanitarian way or in a justice way. So I think a coalition of countries and states should be collaborated in order to implement peace in Yemen.
Okay, I was about to finish. Somebody else has asked a question. Are People for Profit going to organise an event on the 26th of March? Does anybody know? Is there any particular significance? Maybe someone might explain what is happening on the 26th of March. Mohammed, do I see you indicating there?
I was just going to say that we just had a global day of action on January 25th that was led by Stop the War Coalition in the UK, along with Jihan Hakim's Yemeni American Alliance, and a bunch of US-based NGOs and NGOs everywhere.
Peace Corps.
It should be a very successful Zoom meeting that involved a lot of different speakers, I'm sure you're aware of. The idea has come up to do something similar or have a day of action on the anniversary, which is March 26, 2015, the upcoming date, which would mark about, I think, the end of 6 years of war, entering the 7th year of war. So while we don't have anything concrete yet, but there are plans to utilize that date as a for some advocacy on the ground, and to apply some pressure on governments and to speak out about all the injustices and whatnot, and to call for a peace, of course. And so that's all I wanted to say about that. I mean, there's nothing concrete yet, but that date is pretty much set. So something will be happening on that date. I hope that all the NGOs get together, people before profit, the bigger ones, and definitely people like us, our groups will support as much as we can, and are willing to make that happen on that date.
Okay, look, on that note, it's very appropriate to end with a Yemeni speaker. We, as People for Profit, will certainly engage in discussions with the Yemeni community. And if that is a global day of action in support of the call to stop the war in Yemen, you can be absolutely sure we will not be found wanting, and we will give every support on that. Okay, so I just want to thank everybody for coming, thank the audience for listening, thank the speakers for giving us a very informative discussion, and thank you very much, and good night, and take care of yourself in this dreadful period. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.